She was already late. Amelia pulled her coat tighter and broke into a half jog, her breath coming in small white clouds against the pale winter sky. The city was waking up around her, garbage trucks groaning down side streets, pigeons scattering from fire escapes, the distant rhythm of someone's car engine refusing to turn over in the cold. It was the kind of morning that didn't ask permission before it bit you, the kind that reminded you how thin the line was between warmth and its absence. She had been up since 5. The alarm on her phone, the cracked one she kept meaning to replace, had gone off twice before she finally dragged herself out from under the blankets. She worked the early shift at the clothing boutique on 44th, and in the evenings she waitressed at a small Italian place 2 blocks south. Between the 2 jobs, she was making just enough to keep her head above water, send a little home to her mother in Ohio, and still manage to dream. That last part was the hardest. Dreaming on an empty tank was its own kind of discipline. She was sketching in her mind as she walked, a winter collection she'd been piecing together in a notebook she kept under her bed. Clean silhouettes, honest fabrics, nothing that tried too hard. She had a gift for that, for seeing what was essential and stripping away the noise. Her professors at the design school she'd attended for 1 year before tuition ran out had told her that. Before she'd had to leave, she had shown more promise than students who'd been there 3 years. But promise didn't pay rent. She turned the corner onto Bancroft Street, and that's when she saw him. He was sitting on a wooden bench near the entrance to Meridian Park, slightly apart from the main foot traffic, his elbows resting on his knees. He wore a gray shirt, no jacket, no scarf, no gloves. His shoes were clean but light for the weather. His head was tilted slightly downward, and his hands, she could see even from a distance, were trembling. Not dramatically, just that quiet, involuntary trembling that a body does when it has been cold long enough that it stopped fighting. Amelia slowed. She was already late. She knew that. And she'd learned a long time ago that New York had its own rules about how much you saw and how much you pretended not to. You kept moving. You kept your eyes forward. That was the agreement everyone silently made just to get through the day. But something about the way he sat there, not slumped, not defeated, just very still, like a man who had forgotten he was supposed to be somewhere, made her stop. She stood 3 feet away from him for a moment. He didn't look up. She looked down at her coat. It was a good one. Camel-colored, double-breasted, thrifted from a consignment shop on Amsterdam Avenue for $32. She'd been enormously proud of that find. She wore it every winter day without fail. She took it off. "Excuse me," she said. He looked up then. His eyes were dark and sharp and completely awake, the kind of awake that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with a mind that never really stopped. There were faint shadows beneath them, and something around the edges of his expression that she couldn't quite name. Not sadness exactly. Something more like exhaustion with a very specific cause. "You shouldn't give away what you need," he said. His voice was quiet and low and measured in a way that surprised her. Not the voice she'd expected. She held the coat out anyway. "You need it more right now." He studied her for a moment. Then he took it. He didn't thank her with words, just a look. Brief and direct and oddly formal. Like a man who was accustomed to keeping accounts. Amelia turned and kept walking, arms crossed over her thin sweater, moving faster now to generate warmth. She didn't look back. She didn't see the black SUV idling on the far side of the street. She didn't see the driver behind the wheel, watching. And she had absolutely no idea that the man on the bench, the one with the trembling hands and the too thin sweater, was Jason Mercer. She would learn that name very soon. His real name took up a certain amount of space in a room. Jason Mercer, CEO of Mercer Holdings, a privately held company with interests in commercial real estate, luxury hospitality, technology infrastructure, and creative media. Forbes had listed him twice. Business Insider had called him one of the most strategically ruthless minds in American industry. He rarely did interviews. He never attended galas unless the cause was one he'd personally vetted. He was 36 years old, worth somewhere north of $4 billion. And on the morning a young woman in a camel coat stopped to help him, he had been sitting on that bench for 40 minutes. He had left his penthouse at 4:47 a.m. He did this sometimes. Walked. Just walked, with no security detail and no destination, letting the city move around him the way it moved around everyone else. It was the only time he felt anything close to anonymous. The only time the weight of everything he'd built and everything he was currently watching unravel had a chance of feeling smaller than it actually was. 2 weeks ago, his business partner of 8 years, David Harlow, had quietly begun shifting assets. Not dramatically, not stupidly, just carefully enough that Jason almost missed it. He hadn't missed it. He never missed anything. But the discovery had cost him something it was hard to put a name to. It wasn't the money. It wasn't even the betrayal exactly. It was the confirmation of something he'd been working very hard not to believe. That no one was genuine. His engagement had ended 4 months before that. Simone had told him, in the understated way she did everything, that she couldn't compete with his work for his attention. He had wanted to tell her she was wrong. He'd found he couldn't construct the argument convincingly enough. So he sat on a bench in the cold at 5 in the morning, hands shaking, wearing almost nothing, trying to remember what it felt like to be a person and not a position. And then she had appeared. He watched Amelia walk away, arms folded, shoulders back, moving quickly through the cold she had just voluntarily given herself. No hesitation in her stride. No sideways glance to see if he'd noticed the sacrifice. Just a person who had decided something was right and done it and moved on. The SUV pulled up beside the bench a moment later. Marcus, his driver and the only man he trusted completely, stepped out. "Ready, sir?" Jason was still looking at the direction she'd gone. "Marcus." He stood slowly. "Find out who she is." He walked back into the world he controlled. The Mercer Holdings Tower occupied the top 12 floors of a glass building on Lexington. The executive level was the kind of space that announced, without saying a word, that decisions made here had real consequences. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Furniture that cost more per piece than most people's annual rent. A quiet that felt less like peace and more like pressure. Jason's Monday morning began at 8, with a restructuring meeting that lasted 2 hours. He sat at the head of the table and said very little, but when he spoke, every person in the room recalibrated slightly, adjusted their posture, rethought their argument, chose their next words more carefully. That was the effect he had, not through aggression, through a kind of precise, unhurried attention that made people feel they were being read. He had approved 2 acquisitions, declined a third, and redirected an entire marketing strategy with 14 words before his assistant, Priya, knocked and entered with a thin folder. "You asked for this," she said, setting it in front of him. He opened it. There was a name. Amelia Brooks, 23 years old. Current employee of Linden Collective, a boutique retail brand with 2 Manhattan locations. The company was a subsidiary of Mercer Holdings, acquired 3 years ago, and largely left to run itself. There was a photo from the company's staff directory. She was smiling in it. A small, unguarded smile that didn't look like it had been constructed for a camera. Jason looked at the file for a long time without moving. Then, very quietly, set up a meeting. Priya hesitated. "With her? Should I tell her what it's regarding?" "No," he said. "Just tell her to come to the executive floor." Amelia had been at work for 3 hours when the call came down from HR. Her manager, Deborah, called her into the back office and told her there had been a request from Mercer Holdings' executive floor for her to come in for a meeting at 2 o'clock. The address given was the tower on Lexington. Amelia sat with this information for a moment. "Do they say why?" she asked. "No," Deborah said. "But when corporate calls, you go." She went. She took the subway, which was warm and crowded, and stood holding the pole and trying to decide whether she was in trouble. She went through her record at Linden in her head. Punctual. Good with customers. She'd redesigned the window displays twice without being asked, and both times foot traffic had gone up. She had a clean file. She couldn't think of a single thing that warranted a meeting at the top of a 40-floor building. Unless it was a layoff. Unless corporate was trimming the roster, and this was how they did it. Called you in, told you in person, offered you a severance packet in a manila envelope. She stepped off the subway and walked 3 blocks to the address. The lobby was vast and white marbled, and the kind of quiet that required effort to maintain. A receptionist directed her to a bank of elevators and told her to press 38. The ride up was long enough to make her ears pop slightly. The doors opened onto a hallway that smelled of fresh coffee and subtle expense. An assistant, young, impeccable, appeared and guided her to a set of double doors. She opened them without knocking. Amelia stepped into the office. He was standing at the window with his back to her, looking out over the city. He was wearing a charcoal suit that fit him as if it had been built around him specifically. His posture was completely different from the bench. Upright, certain, inhabiting the space. But when he turned around, she saw his face, and the air left her body in a rush. She recognized the eyes first. Sharp, dark, completely awake. The same eyes that had looked at her from a park bench that morning. "Good morning," he said. Same measured voice. Same unhurried delivery. Amelia stood very still. She was aware, in a distant way, that her mouth was slightly open. She closed it. She started. "Jason Mercer." You were on a bench. It came out before she could dress it up. This morning, you were sitting in the cold. I was, he said. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Please sit down. She sat. He sat across from her. Between them was a desk that probably cost more than her monthly take-home, and a silence that felt loaded in multiple directions. I want to ask you something, he said, and I'd like an honest answer. Okay. Why did you give me your coat? She looked at him directly. Because you were cold. That's it. That's it. He studied her the way he'd studied her on the bench, thoroughly, without performance. You didn't know who I was. I didn't, she said. I still don't really. I know your name. Something in his expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. Were you expecting something in return? Amelia felt the question settle into her and understood what was underneath it. She took a breath before she answered. No, she said. That's not how it works. When you give something expecting something back, you haven't really given it. You've made a trade. The silence that followed was longer than the others. You work at Linden, he said. Retail associate. Yes. What did you study? She paused. Fashion design. 1 year. Why only 1 year? Tuition, she said simply. He nodded. He opened a drawer and placed something on the desk between them. It was an envelope. She didn't touch it. What's in that? She asked. A check. She looked at it without reaching for it. I don't want a check. It's a significant amount. I'm sure it is. She kept her hands in her lap. I didn't give you my coat for a check. If I take that, what I did this morning turns into something it wasn't. And I don't want that. He picked the envelope back up. He put it away. He looked at her for a long moment with something in his expression she couldn't categorize. It was too new, too unguarded for his face. We're launching a new division, he said. A creative incubator. We're calling it Foundry. The goal is to identify and develop independent designers and small labels. We've been looking for someone to lead the creative curation side. He paused. I haven't found the right person yet. Amelia's heart rate changed. You'd have a salary, he continued. Studio access. Mentorship connections. Full creative latitude within the scope of the project. He looked at her steadily. It's a real position. Not charity. I need someone who knows what's worth keeping and what's just noise. She sat with it. Her mind was moving quickly. Why me? Because in 8 years of running this company, he said, I can count on one hand the number of people who have done something genuinely selfless in my presence. You stripped away the calculation entirely. He paused. That's a skill. I need people who can see clearly. She was quiet for a moment. I need to know more about the project, she said. Of course. And this isn't contingent on anything personal. It's not, he said. It's a professional offer. Entirely. She nodded slowly. And then she said yes. What followed was the strangest and most clarifying 6 weeks of her life. The Foundry space was on the 22nd floor, open, high-ceilinged, perpetually smelling of fresh coffee and printer toner and occasionally the paint that the graphic team used 3 rooms over. Amelia came in early and stayed late. She built a framework for the curation process from scratch, a system for identifying emerging designers based not just on technical skill, but on point of view. She believed in point of view above everything. Technique could be taught. Perspective was rarer. Jason came by the space twice a week. Usually in the evenings, after the rest of the office had thinned out. They would go over her work, sometimes agreeing, sometimes not. She had discovered quickly that he expected disagreement, that he found agreement without substance either boring or suspicious. This one, she said one evening, holding up a lookbook from a young designer based in Detroit. She's the real thing. Jason turned the pages without hurrying. Her production capacity is limited. So was Dior's in 1946. He looked up. A beat. That's a significant comparison. I know, Amelia said. That's why I made it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he set the lookbook down with something that, if you were paying close attention, looked very much like approval. They had conversations like this regularly. The kind that didn't quite fit into any professional category she'd experienced before. He challenged her constantly, not to undermine her, but because he seemed to believe that good ideas needed pressure to become great ones. She gave the pressure back. She told him when she thought he was wrong. She told him when a proposal he greenlit was based on data that didn't reflect what was actually happening at street level. He listened. Not always immediately, but he listened. The windows of the Foundry faced west, and in the evenings the snow outside caught the last of the light and held it for a moment before the city went dark. She noticed, over those weeks, that he laughed more. Not often, not openly, but there was something loosening in him, a slight softening around the precision that was always there. He started arriving at the Foundry without a specific agenda, sometimes just to ask what she was looking at, what she was thinking about. She started noticing small things, that he took his coffee without anything in it, that he carried a worn notebook rather than using his phone for notes, that when he was thinking hard about something, he went very still in a way most people did the opposite. One evening, near the end of November, she told him, "You don't have to be cold to be powerful." He looked at her. "I see it," she said. "The way you use distance as a strategy. You don't have to. You're sharp enough without it." He didn't respond immediately. He stood at the window and looked out at the city for a long moment. "It's not always a strategy," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I said it." The snow kept falling outside the glass. 3 weeks after that conversation, Jason walked into the foundry unannounced on a Tuesday evening and found Amelia surrounded by fabric swatches, a half-eaten sandwich going cold beside her laptop, and 3 whiteboards covered in her handwriting. He stood at the door for a moment before she noticed him. "What is all this?" he asked. "A curation framework," she said, not looking up. "We've been using subjective criteria to evaluate submissions and calling it instinct. Instinct is real, but it's not a system. If Foundry is going to scale, we need a system that anyone can apply consistently." She finally looked up. "Sorry, I've been thinking about it for a week, and tonight I just needed to get it out of my head." He moved closer and looked at the whiteboard on the left. She had divided the evaluation criteria into 3 pillars: point of view, material integrity, and commercial viability. Beneath each one were sub-questions, detailed, specific, not the kind of thing you wrote down without having thought deeply about them. He read it all without saying anything. Then, the commercial viability pillar. You've weighted it the lowest. Yes. Most investors would weight it highest. Most investors aren't building a creative incubator, she said. They're building a portfolio. We said Foundry was something different. If we weight commercial viability above point of view, we'll end up with everything that already exists. He considered this, stood back slightly, looked at the full picture of all 3 whiteboards together. The commercial pillar still needs teeth, he said. You can have the most original point of view in the world and starve in a studio if you can't move product. Agreed, she said, which is why it's still there. It just doesn't eat the other 2. He looked at her. Send me the framework when it's done. I want to review it before we show it to the board. You mean before you decide whether to show it to the board? She said. The corner of his mouth moved. Yes, he said. That's what I mean. He poured himself a coffee from the carafe in the corner. She had learned that he always drank whatever was already there, never asked anyone to make something fresh, and sat in the chair across from her desk and started reading through the submission files she'd already processed that month. They worked in parallel for an hour without speaking much. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that 2 people arrive at after they've established enough trust to not need to fill the air. At some point she said, without looking up from her screen, "Why did you really go out that morning?" He was quiet for a moment. "I needed to remember what ordinary felt like." "And did you?" "No," he said, "but something better happened." She looked up then. He was reading a file and did not look at her. But his expression had shifted into that rare open quality she'd learned to recognize, the one that appeared only when he had stopped performing for anyone. She went back to her screen. "For what it's worth," she said, "ordinary is overrated." He didn't answer, but she heard, very quietly, the sound of him exhaling, slow and deliberate, and something close to relief. It happened on a Thursday in December. Amelia had come in early to prepare materials for a board presentation. The foundry was 2 months old and showing real results. 4 designers on board, 2 partnership deals in discussion, more press coverage than anyone had predicted. There was momentum, real momentum. She was at her desk when she heard voices in the corridor outside. She recognized one of them, Jarvis, one of the senior executives who had looked through her in every meeting they'd shared. The other voice she didn't know. She wasn't intentionally listening until she heard her own name. "Brooks isn't qualified," Jarvis was saying. "She came from retail. Mercer seems invested," the other voice said. "Mercer is distracted. She gave him her code in a park." A short, dismissive sound. She knew exactly who he was. Played it perfectly. Now she's running a division she has no business running. Amelia stopped moving. The voices continued down the corridor. She sat very still for a moment. Then she stood up, picked up the files she'd prepared, set them back down, and walked to the door. She found Jason in his office. He was alone. She closed the door behind her. He looked up immediately, read her expression. "What happened?" "I don't want to be your charity case," she said. The words came out clean and direct, the way they had on the bench, because she was too shaken to construct them carefully. "I heard what people are saying. That I planned it. That I knew who you were. That this whole thing is, she stopped. I didn't know. You know I didn't know. But it doesn't matter what you know, because the story is already out there and I can't untell it. He stood. Who said that? It doesn't matter who said it. She shook her head. What matters is that I need this to be real, or it means nothing. And right now I can't tell which it is. She turned and walked out. She took the elevator down. She walked out through the lobby and out into the cold and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not knowing which direction to turn. He stood at the window of his office for a long time after she left. He thought about the bench, about the way she had stood there for a moment, looked at him, looked at her coat, and made a decision in a span of seconds that most people would have talked themselves out of over the course of a week. He thought about the first time she'd pushed back on one of his conclusions and the way she'd done it. Not apologetically, not aggressively, but with a specificity that told him she had thought it through completely before she opened her mouth. He thought about what it felt like to be around someone who had no agenda. He had spent the last 4 years, probably longer, in rooms full of people who wanted something from him. He had become expert at identifying the angle, the play, the long game. He had gotten so good at it that he had forgotten what it felt like when there wasn't one. Amelia had reminded him, and he had let the institution he'd built, the layers of assumption and hierarchy and suspicion, threaten to take that away. He picked up his coat. Marcus was waiting downstairs. He told him the address. He knew where she would go. She was at the bench. Of course she was. She hadn't planned it consciously, but her feet had taken her there, through the pale winter morning, past the commuters and the coffee carts and the sound of the city starting another day. She was sitting where he had sat, her arms crossed against the cold, still too light for the weather, because she still hadn't replaced the coat she'd given away. He sat down beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The snow was falling again, very gently, soft and unhurried, the way the city sometimes remembered to be. I shouldn't have left like that, she said finally. You said exactly what needed to be said, he replied. The way you always do. She looked at the ground. I just needed to be real. It is real. He said it without any ornamentation, just directly, in that measured way of his. Amelia, everything in that building is real. What you've built, what you've earned. That's not charity, and it never was. You hired me because of a jacket. I hired you because of what the jacket told me. He paused. There's a difference. The jacket was information. What I did with it was a decision. And I've made a lot of decisions in my life. That one was not wrong. She was quiet. Jarvis will be handled, he said. She shook her head. I don't want you to fight my battles. I know you don't. He almost smiled. I'll fight my own. The one where someone used my company's resources to undermine a colleague. That one belongs to me. They sat in the quiet for a moment longer. The snow touched her hair and melted. You said the morning you gave me your coat, he said, that kindness costs nothing. I thought that. It cost you your warmth for a morning, he said. But what you got back, he stopped. He looked at the park, at the thin white snow on the ground, at the pale sky. He was not a man who said things like this easily, and she knew it. Which made it mean more. You gave me warmth when I had everything and felt nothing. I don't have the right language for what that's worth. She looked at him. His profile was sharp and still in the winter light. She'd learned in 2 months that stillness in him was the highest form of honesty. A partnership, he said. Equal ground. Foundry becomes its own entity. You hold creative directorship with equity. I provide infrastructure and capital. We build something that belongs to both of us. He turned to look at her. Not a benefactor. Not a charity. A partnership. She held the word for a moment. Let it sit in her hands. Okay, she said. The snow kept falling, patient and unhurried, as if it had never been in a hurry at all. 1 year later, on the first morning of December, the Foundry held its first independent runway showcase. 12 designers. A converted warehouse space in Brooklyn, every seat taken. Editors and buyers, and people who mattered sat in the same rows as people who were just there because someone had told them something real was happening. Amelia stood backstage in a coat she had designed herself, structured, clean-lined, made from a heavy cream fabric that held its shape beautifully. She had been up since 4. Not because of an alarm she kept meaning to replace, but because her mind was already moving, already in the day, already full. She could hear the crowd beyond the curtain. Jason found her backstage 20 minutes before the show started. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a dark coat, the same notebook in his breast pocket. He looked at the space she'd built. The lights, the sequence, the way the music moved. You did this, he said. We did this, she said. He didn't argue. Somewhere in his office on the 38th floor, in a simple wooden frame on the wall beside the window, there was a camel-colored coat, double-breasted, slightly worn at the cuffs. He'd had it cleaned and preserved and framed without telling her. She found out weeks later when she went up to review a contract and noticed it there. She stood in front of it for a long time. When she asked him about it later, he said only, "It's the most important thing I own." She had looked at him for a moment, and then she had said, "You still owe me $32. He had laughed, really laughed, the kind that surprised both of them. The runway lights went up. The first model appeared. The crowd went still. The snow was falling gently outside the warehouse windows, soft and weightless, the same as it had been that first morning when a young woman on her way to work had looked at a man on a bench and made a quiet decision. She had no idea, in that moment, that she was changing two lives. But that was the thing about that kind of kindness. It never knew what it was starting. And that was exactly what made it real. If you love this wonderful story, please that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below. See you in the next one.